Good morning, everyone. Let's begin. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you. You're in for a really wonderful conversation. I do want to say that we've got a great fall conference coming up about peacemaking, just peacemaking, and there's flyers on the table over there. I heartily recommend this. Let's get to work. Laurie Brand is the Robert Granford Wright Professor of International Relations at the University of Southern California. She served as the director of the Center for International Studies from 1997 to 2000 and served as the director of the School of International Relations from 2006 to 2009. She's past president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America, currently chair of its Committee on Academic Freedom. She specializes in Middle East international relations and inter-Arab politics, a Carnegie Scholar for 2008 to 10, a four-time Fulbright Scholar to the Middle East and North Africa, the author of Palestinians in the Arab World, Institution Building and the Search for State, Jordan's Inter-Arab Relations, the Political Economy of Alliance Making, and Women, the State and Political Liberalization, and Citizens Abroad, States and Migration in the Middle East and North Africa. And she's got a book she's now putting to rest on national narrative, which I can't wait to get my hands on because narrative is so important. Her current research interests include immigration, state expatriate relations, and national narrative construction. She's carried out field work in Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and Kuwait. Fluent in Arabic and French, highly proficient in Spanish, which is really wonderful because when I talk to her, I like to try out my Arabic and Spanish on her. And I've been appropriately called to stop. But now, to the introduction. Laurie Brand is one of my favorite people on the planet because she brings great passion, incandescent brilliance, marvelous education, unwavering progressive perspectives, and she is never a slave to convention and thinking the way we used to think. She brings new consciousness to me every time I hear her. She's a member of All Saints Church. She's a great friend. I am so happy she's here. Will you please warmly welcome Laurie Brand.
I've never been introduced and had tears come to my eyes, but anyway, that was beyond generous, and I'm very grateful. It's wonderful to be here. It's been a while since I've spoken in the forum, and it's wonderful to be back. So whatever happened to the Arab Spring? What I want to do today, we don't have a lot of time, and I certainly want to leave some time for questions. I want to review briefly the causes, but I want to spend a lot of time on that. I want to spend more time talking about the impact on two countries in particular, but in Q&A I'd be happy to speak about others. I want to focus on Syria and Egypt. I would just say that in thinking about what's happened since late winter, early spring of 2011, as someone who's been studying the region since a long time ago, since the late 70s, it may occur to you that there are very few times when there are episodes that are subjects of or cause for optimism or exhilaration. Certainly the spring of 2011 was one of those few times, and I was fortunate to have had a reduced teaching load, so I was able to sit in front of the TV and watch as the crowds came out into Tahrir Square in Cairo, and we're in Bourguiba Street in Tunisia calling for the overthrow of their dictators. It was an enormously emotional and exciting time. The question then is what's happened since then, and perhaps because of the passion, because of the interest that I have in the region, there was a desire to project only positive outcomes when I should have been a bit more realistic. So let's review what some of the causes were and then talk about what's happened in a couple of cases. Briefly, economic stagnation throughout the region, in particular youth unemployment, the famous youth bulge that so many analysts talked about at the time, but also to the extent that there was economic development, it was economic development that tended to benefit just a small elite, and the rest of the populations tend to be under increasing strain and pressures. There was also political and economic corruption, authoritarian rule, which combined with bureaucratic and developmental inefficiencies, which led to declining amounts and quality in the goods and services that these governments were delivering to their populations, whether we're talking about education or talking about health care, other social services. There were also brutal security forces, police, internal security. Each of these regimes has a whole series of these sorts of forces. They also played an important role. And then interestingly, in Syria in particular, and perhaps a harbinger of things to come, I think we can directly attribute climate change as one of the major causes of the uprising in Syria. Climate change, which led to terrible drought, combined with the kind of bureaucratic inefficiency that I talked about, poor governmental response, a clear reason behind the initial outbreak of the uprising. So we can talk about that later if you're interested. Now, I want to talk a bit about, because I want to talk about outcomes, or sort of maybe, I mean, these are still processes, these are still countries in transition, so I try and not be too pessimistic about things, because these are processes that continue to be underway. But for now, if we want to take a look at the degree of violence that has characterized some of these uprisings, as well as the prospects for the achievement, perhaps, of greater social justice, then I think we need to keep in mind some of the factors that I want to talk about now. One of the things is the degree of involvement by regional actors and extra-regional actors in each of these processes of transition. So if we go through the various countries that have been affected by, I stopped calling it the Arab Spring a long time ago, so the Arab uprisings, we'll call it, then it's important to understand the role that players outside of each country arena has had. And in general, if I were to put a banner theme across this, I would say that the earlier the uprising and sort of the sooner its initial phase was over, the less the degree of external involvement. Let me just run through some of these very quickly. Tunisia was the first. It happened very fast. The dictator, Ben Ali, was gone in a matter of a couple of weeks. In Egypt, which came second, stretched out a little bit longer, and there certainly were attempts by Saudi Arabia they offered money to Mubarak to stay in power. They tried to convince the United States to continue to support Mubarak, but ultimately Mubarak was forced to step down. Things begin to get a bit more problematic, or the degree of external engagement becomes deeper and with more sort of deleterious effect when we move on then to the next country, which is Bahrain, where a peaceful uprising was ultimately put down by the intervention of Saudi military forces. They simply drove across the causeway and put an end to the uprising. In the case of Yemen, which got much less attention in the United States, where there were massive, massive mobilizations of people for months on end, but a stalemate based on the balance of power between the president and those who opposed him, there was very early on intervention by members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, that is Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and others. Their major concern, of course, was not trying to achieve any sort of significant reform, but simply to try and reimpose stability. So to try and find some sort of a formula whereby the president could be eased out and as little as possible could be changed. Now, the case of Yemen, and this is something to put on the radar screens for the future, because Yemen isn't a disaster waiting to happen. Yemen is a disaster happening. Yemen, malnutrition, which has never really been a problem in the Middle East, rarely a problem. Malnutrition affecting a growing portion of the Yemeni population. In addition, overdrawing of water resources as a result of skewed agricultural patterns now means that Yemen is facing increasing water shortages, and it has the largest population of any country on the Arabian Peninsula. This is really a dreadful situation, and when one focuses, as the US media does, in looking at at Yemen solely on whether al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is operating there and where, and drone strikes and so on. It really misses the underlying dynamics behind the lack of stability and the problems that Yemen currently faces. Turning to Libya. Libya is the first of these Arab uprisings that becomes internationalized. Qatar was the one Arab state that was actively calling for external intervention as Libyans were protesting against Gaddafi, and the Gaddafi regime was reacting with violent force, with military force. And so we then ultimately ended up with a NATO intervention, right? But not a short NATO intervention. I mean, the initial intervention was projected to be perhaps a couple of weeks. It ended up going on a number of months. Gaddafi was finally killed, his regime overthrown. But we have an ongoing situation of instability in Libya. It's not clear at all what the end game is going to be there. And then finally Syria, where we have what I would call a fully regionalized and internationalized conflict. On the one side, we have Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah supporting the Syrian regime. On the other side, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, to a lesser extent Jordan, the United States and other Western states supporting various members of what's the opposition, but which is by no means unified, which is by no means captured by simply referring to the Free Syrian Army or referring to the Nusra Front or any of these things. There are, at last count, I heard something like 200 different militias operating in various parts of Syria. They're with changing alliances, some of which most recently have begun fighting each other. In some cases, it's over ideological differences, but in other cases, it's just over control and booty, control of access and resources in a particular area. So we have this highly, as I said, regionalized and internationalized conflict in Syria, which makes it exceedingly difficult to not only to understand, but also to think about a solution for. And as I said when I spoke to the vestry a couple of weeks ago, and I found out later that actually former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates said this, so I don't know whether I plagiarized him and I don't remember it, or whether I just came up with this on my own. Anyway, but one way to think about, say, Saudi involvement in Syria is that the Saudis are ready to fight Iran to the last Syrian. And I think that's an apt characterization. All right, so if we look at what the impact of this internationalization of the conflict is on Syria first, and then at the end of my remarks I'll talk a little bit about Egypt, which is a very different case, but is also very, very disturbing at this point in time. One of the most obvious and dreadful aspects of the current civil war in Syria is the refugee problem that's been created. Now, the Levant, that is the eastern part of the Arab world, basically, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, and so on, its politics have for decades been shaped in part by refugee flows. So most recently, it's been Iraqi refugees, that is prior to this outflow of Syrians, but certainly with Palestinians, 1948, 1967, and so on. The Syrian refugee crisis now stands poised to overwhelm a couple of the surrounding countries. So with all the implications that has for Syrians themselves and for Syria as a country, but also the implications it has for the surrounding states. So just to give you some idea of the magnitude of the problem, the Syrian refugee crisis is now surpassing the Afghan refugee crisis, which to date had been the most serious, the largest of refugee crises in sort of the Asia or Western Asia area. In Lebanon, there are currently over 1 million, and these are all guesstimates. I mean, they're sort of our best guesses because we don't have good statistics. Over 1 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Lebanon, a country of about 5 million people. And if the outflows continue as they have been, the estimate is that there could be up to 2.3 million Syrians in Lebanon as we move toward 2014. These people, the Syrians in Lebanon, are not in camps, so they are trying to find refuge wherever they can. It's important to point out that Syrian workers in Lebanon were discriminated against even before this outpouring of Syrian refugees, so the situation is therefore even worse. And there have been increasing manifestations of the spillover of the Syrian conflict into Lebanon itself, with clashes between Sunni extremists and fighters from Hezbollah. There have been a number of instances of bombings lately. So Lebanon is, even though its civil war period is over a decade past, there still is a significant possibility of renewed violence in Lebanon. In Egypt, there are perhaps 500,000 Syrian refugees. Interestingly, they were initially welcomed, but since the 3rd of July overthrow of President Morsi, that situation has changed dramatically. They have all been characterized as supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they've been therefore increasingly harassed, humiliated, often turned back when they've arrived in Egypt for refuge. In the case of Jordan, where there are perhaps somewhere over 500,000, moving up toward 1 million, again, we don't know. There's only one formal camp in Jordan, that's the Zaatari camp, which is close to the border with Syria. Initially, again, the Syrians were welcomed, but as the numbers have increased, so have the social pressures that they've placed on Jordanian society. And Jordan is a population of about 7 million. So again, if you're talking about the introduction of 500,000 and climbing refugees, this is a serious burden for a country to shoulder. And the financial support that Jordan has received from the international community, with a term which I hate, really doesn't come close to providing to offsetting the kinds of burdens that these people represent in the form of housing, education, healthcare, and so on. Now, overall, somewhere over 1 million Syrian children are now refugees. And so they're subject to, women and children tend in refugee situations to suffer more. We have problems with providing education for these children, so inferior education, inferior health, inferior nutrition, potentially, if this continues, potentially a generation lost in Syria. And that's, of course, in addition to all of the destruction internally, the sort of physical destruction of buildings and other sorts of infrastructure. Now, the regime itself certainly has more firepower than the opposition and it bears the primary responsibility for the dreadful death and destruction. But one cannot overlook the fact that there are war crimes that have been committed by the opposition as well. And that's really very important to keep in mind. Final point on Syria has to do with sectarianism, because as you read in the press, the conflict itself, the way it's being presented, is almost exclusively in sectarian terms now. If we go back to the beginning of the conflict, certainly, in order to understand it, we needed to understand rural-urban dynamics in Syria. We also needed to understand class dynamics in Syria, regional ones, as well as some dealing with sectarianism. But there's no question that as the civil war has gone on, that it has taken on an increasingly sectarian character. I'd be lying to you if I said otherwise. So that dividing lines between groups are often now, according to whether one is Sunni or Shia, or whether one is Alawite, Christian, Kurd, Turkoman, or whatever. And as I said before, there's also increasingly intra-oppositional fighting that's taking place in Syria. Okay, so that's the dreary, the disastrous situation in Syria. Let me turn to Egypt, where, if we turn the clock back a year and several months ago, Egypt had its first free elections. And even though the candidate choice wasn't necessarily what everyone would have desired, nonetheless, the elections took place. People broadly accepted the outcome of the elections and then looked to move forward. Turn the clock forward, and I don't think anyone would have anticipated that a year later, one would end up having a massive popular mobilization demanding early elections, that is the ouster of the elected president, that would then be brought to an end basically by a military intervention, which has been followed by what can only, I think, be described as a vicious assault against, members of the Muslim Brotherhood. I was in Egypt and Tunisia, actually, in June. A number of friends of mine were involved in gathering signatures. If you followed this, you know this. There was a campaign to gather signatures called Tamarrud, which means rebel. And the idea was to get enough signatures, as many signatures as President Morsi had secured votes for his presidential win the year earlier. It was clear to me at the time that I was in Egypt that the frustration, the anger toward the Muslim Brotherhood was palpable, but I could not have predicted what has happened since the 3rd of July. It can only be described, as I said, as a vicious assault against a group which had run legally for political office. I'm not a fan of the Muslim Brotherhood, so don't misunderstand me. But the type of villainization that's taken place, the hysteria, the chauvinism that has emerged in the Egyptian press, that has been practiced within the Egyptian body politic, so that anybody who has dared to question this kind of brutal crackdown, which, as you may be aware, led the awful example on the 14th of August to the murder of somewhere around 800 demonstrators who were in 2 different kind of encampments in different parts of Cairo. Prior to that assault, there was unbelievable propaganda in the Egyptian press claiming that the people who were engaged in these encampments had chemical weapons. There were claims that they had heavy weaponry. I mean, it was just, you see these headlines on Egyptian newspapers, and it just sort of took my breath away. But it was happening. My first experiences in the Middle East were in Egypt in the late 1970s. And while I didn't follow Egypt closely in, I would say, the 1990s, I think I can safely say that it's an unprecedented sort of domestic, as I said, chauvinism, hysteria, operated against or visited upon a particular group. At no point during even the most repressive days of the Nasser regime did we have the kind of murdering of opposition that we've seen in the case of Egypt today. And those who've tried to speak out against repression have been labeled traitors. Some of you who follow Egypt may remember Mohammed, we'll call him Baradei in English, I guess, who became a part briefly of this transitional government, but then resigned because said he couldn't countenance the violence that was being used. The assault against him in the Egyptian press, the Egyptian media, is just unbelievable. Basically, there's been a court case raised against him, charging him with treason. And that's the kind of stuff that's happening in Egypt. Anyway, let me just finish with something to keep in mind as we watch, particularly the transitions in Egypt. I hope that what's happening in Egypt this is one stage in what will continue to be an unfolding of Egypt's revolution, and not a stage at which we are going to come to rest for an extended period of time. But of course, one doesn't know. Part of what's been involved in a number of these struggles, certainly in Egypt, certainly in Tunisia, and in Syria, but in a somewhat different way, is the attempt by these societies to come to grips with the relationship between religion and state. What should be the proper relationship between the place of a society's religious identity and its formal governing documents like constitutions, like electoral laws? How do we understand that relationship going forward? Is it possible to have a civil state and yet one in which people still feel that their religious prerogatives and so on is properly respected and upheld? Those are the kinds of discussions that are part of the discussions that ended up pushing Egypt to where it is today, not the only ones. They certainly have been involved in leading to a stagnation in what's happened in Tunisia, and of course the relationship between religion and civil society in Syria is clearly part of the ongoing conflict there. So I'll stop, and then I'm happy to take your questions.
Let's hear you talk a little bit first before we open it up. Thanks, Lori. So Lori and I are going to talk just a little bit together, and then we're going to open it up. So go ahead and get your microphones and get your questions ready. I asked Lori to come and speak at the vestry meeting in September because we looked like we were on the brink of bombing Syria. And the president spoke that night, so she sat with us while the vestry had a kind of a working dinner, and we watched the president. And this was a pretty saber-rattling kind of speech, and Lori gave a great critique of it. And then everything kind of changed just in a matter of days. And I think that it provides a part of a frame for us to now engage Lori about these questions. And that frame being, you know, you spoke of Saudi Arabia and a lot of others, and you mentioned us, but can you just kind of speak about what's going on in American foreign policy? That is, I mean, Tom Hayden is saying that the peace movement has some muscle that it's not had before. And I don't know if that's the case or not, but Lori watches all this. So could you talk a little bit, please, my friend, about the frame of, and then let's get into these countries. What the hell's going on?
I wish I knew. I think, you know, the Obama administration came to power, my goodness, I'm starting to sound like I'm talking about. I actually saw an interesting article the other day where someone was writing about U.S. politics in the way that U.S. journalists, using the same kind of language, terminology that U.S. journalists used about of other countries. It was very revealing. Anyway, because there's certain things we don't say where we won't talk about. You know. But when the Obama administration came to Washington, there clearly was a desire to change the tone and I think much of the practice vis-a-vis parts, at least, of the Arab world or the broader Muslim world. And of course, there was Obama's speech in Cairo in which he sort of made his initial overture. They couldn't have foreseen the outbreak of these various uprisings, revolts, revolutions, and so on. This would have been enormous. This kind of sort of rolling instability would have been enormously challenging for any administration to deal with. And so to a certain extent, at least on that front, I think they have to be given a little bit of leeway because there were just too many moving parts, too many different groups at work, too many different kind of expectations. Do you try and reinforce someone who has been your ally all along? When do you let go? I mean, that was clearly the issue when it came to Mubarak, and there were criticisms that the U.S. held on too long. Of course, the Saudis felt that we should have, held on much longer. We certainly have some problems with our Saudi allies at this point. They've not been happy with the way that we dealt with Egypt. They're not happy with the way that we've dealt with the Syrian issue currently, and so there are tensions that have emerged between the United States and other allies as these different parts continue to shift. And I didn't even begin to talk about shifting alliances because that's another issue. But I mean, in terms of part of what the Obama administration has tried to do is remove as much as possible a heavy American footprint while still trying to achieve certain foreign policy goals. So that's why, and I think part of why if you can call it the peace movement was successful in this last instance was precisely because of the war weariness of the population, and also I think the degree to which people have seen that the kinds of the ways we've been involved militarily haven't served, unless there's a different set of interests I don't know of, and that's certainly possible, but certainly haven't served the interests of establishing more participatory and less, human rights abusing sorts of regimes in the region. So the Obama administration has tried to remove our military footprint, but on the other hand, of course, this president has authorized the use of drones and drone warfare in a way which is absolutely unprecedented, well beyond anything that the Bush administration did. And I can only assume that that's because of this desire to pull back from a full-fledged military, troops on the ground involvement. And please don't use boots on the ground as a term. I think that is, and to try and lessen that. I mean, the American public in general is not aware as much of the drone issue. There are drone bases that are secret, that are not, or at least not well publicized. And so that's been the way that Obama has gone about this. Now, in terms of, we also have to factor in when it comes to an issue like Syria, as I said, that we've got our regional allies, and then there are also different domestic forces at work. We have some people in the Congress, in the Senate in particular, Senators McCain and Graham, who seem never to have seen a potential military engagement that they didn't want to jump into feet first. And so, they continue to use this narrative about free Syrian army when, when supporting the opposition, the democratic opposition, the moderate opposition, when these terms don't mean anything in the Syrian case. or mean very little in the Syrian case. So there are these kinds of pressures as well that Obama has had to try and deal with. I think the president was, to a certain degree, sort of the victim of his own rhetoric by setting this red line about the use of chemical weapons. So I think that there have been some missteps, just some errors that have been made along the way. Anyway, that's...
So, and that is an amazing quotation, whether you originated it or whatever his name is, Burns it, about fighting in Syria to the last Iranian.
No,
Fighting.
Saudi Arabia fighting Iran to the last Syrian.
Thank you. Okay. So what about Iran? I mean, is this a charm offensive that absolutely has no substance? Or just to kind of strike a note about Iran, and then let's get into Egypt and Syria?
Okay. Well, I think we need to engage this. The idea that military action against Iran, this is something that this administration has not wanted and has found all sorts of reasons for trying to pull back from, argue against, and I think that's a good thing. I think that's been a wise policy. It is still, I would just remind all of you who don't know, it is still not clear. In fact, many people who know a lot would say it is in fact clear that Iran does not have a nuclear weapons program. Iran has a nuclear program. It is a program for developing nuclear capability, which it contends has solely civilian uses. People who I trust, I think, argue that what Iran would like to have is what they call a breakout capability. That is to move its, and I don't know the technical stuff here, so but to have in place what it would need so that if the threat arose, it would be able, perhaps within a year, to develop some sort of a weapons capability. But that these people argue we should take the leadership at its word, and that at this point they don't have an interest in developing nuclear weapons. Bear in mind that Iran has, while it has certainly engaged in supporting groups that have undertaken what have been classified as terrorist activities in various parts of the world in certain periods, Iran has not invaded or attacked any country that I can remember, all right? So when one listens to those who are most actively calling for an attack on Iran because of Iran's purported aggressive intentions, it would be well to keep in mind just exactly what sort of aggressive intentions those countries have and how they've manifested them in the region as well. So I think that it's very important that the United States engage, and I would, would you allow me to make one criticism, Ed? I would banish the term charm offensive from my language. I know, you were referring to somebody else. No, I think, and I was really disappointed I had to hear Gwen Eiffel on the NewsHour the other night use it, because I think what it does is it makes it sound like it's not serious. It makes it sound like it's just, I don't know, somebody getting, all spiffied up to go out, and that there's nothing, there's no substance to it. And I think that it just by virtue of using that term, you almost delegitimize it. You render it less serious than I think we should take it. Now, the Iranians have interests. The problem is we don't seem to accept that other countries have interests. And you may not like them, we may not like them, but other countries have interests too, and other countries have, they have the right to pursue their interests. Now, the problem is when the pursual of those interests, comes in conflict with ours, but to sort of, to characterize any country's attempt to pursue its own interests as if it's by definition illegitimate seems to be really problematic, particularly if we're trying to be serious policymakers and trying to understand policy in any serious terms. So I think we need to take this initiative, this potential opening, seriously, and hopefully there won't be. I guess there are voices in the Congress now that are eager to try and ratchet up the sanctions further. Well, that's just a way of trying to deep six this thing. If it plays out in such a way that it becomes apparent that the Iranians weren't serious, then you can think about alternative policy instruments. But to try and deep six it, to make it fail up front, I think is a very dangerous sort of policy, and I don't think serves U.S. interests at all.
Laurie, thank you so much, and thank you especially for bringing Yemen to the front. I think it's a country we don't know enough about or understand its role and the importance that it's going to play. But regarding Syria, I worry that the Syrian situation, as you said, is becoming much more fragmented. And I think back to Yugoslavia, and another Western construct of a country, just like Syria was, that was held together with these ethnic groups and finally fractured from internal pressures when you didn't have a strong man leading it anymore. What is the potential for drawing this shattered egg back together again, or are we looking at some sort of new lines where you have a separate little Kurdistan and a separate or the Turkomans join up with somebody else, or what do you do with the Alawites and the Christians?
Well, I wish I had a crystal ball to be able to answer with some real clarity, but I think that it depends on how long this goes on. So that because we're looking at issues not only of trying to rebuild some sort of political community, but you're also looking at what will be tremendous demands for infrastructure rebuilding after this is over. And it's the destruction isn't over yet, so we don't know what the full extent of that is going to be. Plus repatriation of people. So that even if things were to end tomorrow, the challenges are so dramatic. And what we have at this stage, at least, is we have a number of key groups within the opposition who have made clear that they have no intention of participating in this meeting that the United States and the Russians are trying to put together in Geneva to discuss some sort of a peace settlement. I mean, the parties have to themselves have some willingness to come together. And Assad says he won't talk to any of the terrorists. As far as he's concerned, the only opposition that isn't terrorist are the ones that are still basically participating with him. So I mean, there's this huge gulf between the two. And that makes it sound like there's sort of coherent two sides, and I think that's not the case. The only thing that I think militates against some sort of fragmentation that would sort of crystallize into these mini states is things like economic efficiency and just the way that regional states have influence on how those things happen. I don't think any regional state is interested in seeing Syria fall apart. And I mean, clearly some have an interest in trying to see the regime overthrown, but I don't think they bargained on this kind of potential fragmentation. So I think one has to think about the factors that would militate against that kind of a disintegration. But again, we don't know whether this time next year we're going to be talking about a serious peace conference, or whether this is something that could go on for years, as we saw in the case of Lebanon, for example, which was 15-year civil war. There's just no way to know.
Is there a question over here? Right here. Latest great.
Thanks so much, Laurie. Glenn Stassen. You said that Obama's policy has been to try to remove a heavy military footprint, which I think is a good thing for sure, with a lot of resentment that caused. Mm-hmm. And then you said, but still influence some outcomes. And do you see a vision by the Obama administration of trying to sort of steadily but somewhat gently prodding the various countries to gradually move toward a more human rights emphasis? For example, in Syria, if the Kurds and the Christians and so on, and the Alawites felt there was going to be a human rights regime, so I mean, they'd be able to continue. That would help a lot. And if Egypt eventually moves toward a real election, and a real constitution, is that something the U.S. can do, is sort of keep trying to gently nudge them toward a human rights emphasis?
Well, I mean, at this point, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. There just seems to me to be so many steps away from where we are. I mean, in Egypt right now, where you have a good portion of the population cheering on the imprisonment and worse of what of a party that can count supporters among, I would say, somewhere between 10 and 20% of the population. That's not a body politic that's interested in human rights protection. Sorry, but they're not. People who could call out for the intervention of the military less than a year after people were in the streets criticizing the military and calling for the downfall of the military precisely because of some of the massacres that the military had committed. There's something else which is going on there, and so calling for preservation of human rights, I think, is admirable, but in some ways premature at this stage. I think the Obama administration at this point, when it comes to Egypt, they clearly wanted to send a message that they were disturbed, unhappy with what was going on, but they didn't want to jeopardize the relationship. And that's been the story of the Egyptian-American relationship for a long time across a number of administrations. I think if we're talking about what's happening in Syria, it's not even just human rights. It's like, can I be sure that I can live in a regime that is run by somebody else? And at that point, I mean, given what's been going on, I think a lot of people have good reason to doubt that. So that's another step beyond, can I be sure that my rights will be protected, as opposed to will they kill me or not? So I just think we're in several of these countries. We're not even at that point yet.
Thank you. I have a good friend from Egypt, and he's Coptic, and I've enjoyed talking about the two different narratives of the two different religions. Apparently, there's a large percentage, a large number of Muslims who accept Christianity as neighbors, friends, even protect them, and yet churches are burned, things like this. How do we go about understanding the relationship, and it must be incredibly complex, between the Christian community and the Muslim community in Egypt and maybe throughout the Levant?
I think one thing is we always have to try and contextualize, both historically as well as kind of spatially. So these relationships change over time, and they also vary from one place to another. Even within Egypt itself, there are different sorts of relationships. So what I would say in the case of Egypt is that one of the dirty games that the Mubarak regime played was to do whatever it could to convince the Christians, and overwhelmingly in Egypt, the Christians are the Coptic community, convince them that the only thing that stood between them and some dreadful takeover of the government by Muslim extremists was the Mubarak regime. Okay, so you basically say, accept us with all of our faults, all of our repression, all of this, because we'll at least protect you. But at the same time, the regime was working in other ways to sort of stoke intercommunal tensions from time to time. So they'd allow a church to be burned. They'd allow a church to be bombed. And then, throw up there, who could have done this? Oh, it must have been these awful extremists. So the regime played a dirty game in that way. And part of what results from that, though, is a great deal of suspicion and lack of confidence in the police, in the state. So it's not a healthy situation at all. And one of the things that happened with the 30 June demonstrations and then the 3 July removal of Morsi was that it was easy to target, because of some of the things that Morsi's government had done, increasingly put in place things that suggested this was not going to be a government for all Egyptians. This was going to be a government of the Muslim Brotherhood, for not just for Muslims, but for supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood. That there was certainly Christians were very prominent in their participation in these 30 June demonstrations. Well, that then just set them up to be obvious targets in the aftermath. And I also think that the military allowed that to happen. Because why should it be in a situation where you are bringing to bear force against the Muslim Brotherhood, arresting them in large numbers in various parts of the country, that churches sit unprotected? And then the military afterwards says, oh, well, you know what we're going to do? We're very sorry this happened. We're going to help. We're going to pay for the rebuilding of the churches. It's all part of the same strategy. To leave Christians exposed from time to time, allow whoever happens to be a fanatic, and I wouldn't and I would not put past supporters of the regime engage in these things from time to time and making it look like it's members of the Muslim Brotherhood or some other Muslim Islamist organization, all as part of a way of feeding into this ugly dynamic whereby Christians feel that the only protection they have is in the current power holder.
Nice, Lori Brand. Illuminating and so grand. Right? Both.